Staying in contact. I'm London Mitchell. Each week we take a few minutes to talk about our community of Northwest Ohio, issues we face, people addressing those issues, and sometimes we talk about our history, culture, and heritage. In this installment, it's mostly nostalgic. My guest is local history buff and storyteller Ted Long. Ted's latest book, Table for None, Lost Eateries of Toledo, is what Ted calls a full course feast of stories, menus, matchbooks, napkins, and memories from the restaurants that once defined Toledo's flavor. The book is nostalgia on steroids, as many of Ted's books are.
I think Toledo is a town that loves its history, but more than anything else, it loves nostalgia. And I enjoy sitting with people and listening to their stories about, their childhood or, the different restaurants that, for example, that their family used to eat in. You can just literally watch that person going back in time as they're describing, um, these events that took place at certain places. And so I just enjoy gathering all that up and as a storyteller retelling that. And as I go out and talk to people about this book, literally every time someone has to mention a family restaurant that they always went to or a favorite meal that they always had at a certain restaurant, people this really connects with people.
And the way to connect with people usually is through food. And you have really, I think, opened the floodgates to remembering and nostalgia, and with your book all about restaurants that really don't exist anymore except in our memories.
Yeah, that's right. So the book itself was interesting at how it came about. Um, I was working on my last book that came out last fall, the Toledo Papers, and I was working with Mark Snyder, who he's a local collector of Toledo ephemera and really probably has one of the largest collections around. And he was helping me find items to use for the Toledo Papers book. I was looking for items that would help um, allow me to tell stories behind them. So it could be a ticket to the Dempsey Willard fight or a poster from a certain event that happened at the Valentine Theater. And as we were going through some of this stuff, Mark kept reminding me of all these menus that he had from restaurants of the past. And one time we got together and he brought this tub out and it was filled with menus and napkins and swizzle sticks, matchbooks, you name it, from these names that you instantly recognized but are now gone. And right away I said, Mark, we're gonna the next book is gonna be about these restaurants. And literally, I published the Toledo Papers in late September, and I started on this book October 1st, and we finished it at the end of April, and now it's out. And it was a joy to put together because of A, working with Mark and his collection, but B, getting to tell these backstories of these places that are so memorable for people in Toledo.
Now, we got together for coffee a week or so ago, and you showed me a what would you call the author's
Authors authors
edition?
proof,
Yeah,
yeah.
to proofread and that. I was fascinated because this is not just a book that talks about restaurants in Toledo, but it's filled with photographs and copies of menus. And if that doesn't take us back,
Yeah. I think that's really the part that makes the book so effective is that the tangible part of, reading about John Krotzer and his first restaurant, the Garden Inn on Monroe Street, and then you turn the page and there's the menu, page by page, every item. You could see the grease marks on it. I mean, it's an original, and it tells the story.
before we go any further, we have to run down the list of some of the restaurants that are discussed in the book, and just the mention of their names is enough to take us back to our childhood or our early adulthood.
That's right. I when we started off talking about it, I talked to many friends, many of whom were lifelong Toledoans, And I wanted to make sure we didn't leave anybody out. We're going to leave somebody out, but I didn't want to leave any really obvious ones out. And we ended up with about 100 restaurants, all gone, but remembered. And I ended up, we called that list down to 75. So the book has about 75 restaurants mentioned or and documented with the original, but when it was founded, when it closed, who were the owners, all the vitals, along with, is my I said Mark has everything, and I was shocked when he told me what he had, but when you see it, swizzle sticks from um, different restaurants and matchbooks and napkins. It's just pretty cool stuff.
So we're talking about Red Wells and Gracie Smith's
Exactly.
cafeteria downtown, and
hmm
boy, what Bud and Luke's.
Bud and Luke. That was a story I was not prepared for when I got into that. Didn't realize that the two owners left relatively early on in the development of Bud and Luke. And it's a great story behind that. I won't give it away, but I was kind of surprised. Ernie Pyle, the journalist, plays a big part in it. He wrote about Bud and Luke, and Bud and Luke became a tourist attraction for Toledo in the late 30s. People would come to town and say, what do you want to do? I want to go to Bud and Luke.
Let's take a drive down Monroe Street. Wasn't the Kua on Monroe?
Akuaku was off Detroit and Monroe, yeah, on that
Yeah.
corner. And then as you progressed from West Toledo out towards Sylvania, I think Mary Alice Powell from the Blade, she called it the Monroe Street Circuit. And she was often in these restaurants doing reviews, but you'd have Van's Colonial, the Willows, Krotzer's, the Garden Inn. Um, those are names that people instantly recognize if they're from Toledo.
And what was that really fancy, expensive restaurant? Fifi's?
Fifi's, yeah, we talk about Fifi's, and we have a Fifi's menu in the book as well. She was quite a character, and that's somebody I met once when early on, and when we moved here, my wife and I had dinner there, and she was quite a personality.
When we talk about Toledo and nostalgia, the restaurants, your books, and we talk about this underlying theme of nostalgia, but really there's a lot to Toledo that when you put it all together can make you think, hey, this town, this community that I live in, or maybe it's my hometown, there's really a lot to say about
hmm
this community. And Toledo gets knocked around a lot. And I think, personally, unjustified is this knockaround.
Totally agree. We've talked about this. I think as someone who moved here from outside, I think people have a even bigger appreciation for what we have here, having lived somewhere else. And a lot of people who've grown up here and never been anywhere have an attitude that it must be better somewhere else, so they just kind of throw us under the bus. I think that's changing. I think there's a lot of positive energy now. We're moving in the right direction, and I feel like it's one reason why nostalgia is so big in Toledo is because we get, knocked on the chin so often. People like to go back in the past and say, "Well, I remember when," and talk about days that they think were better. Um, I told someone the other day in an interview, they asked me about that, and I said, "Well, I've heard people talk about Toledo was much better back in the old days. I've seen pictures of Toledo in the olden days, and I tell you, it wasn't." I mean, downtown across the way where we now have the restaurants on the docks, that was a coal yard. And trains were just pouring coal in and out of that every day, and we were burning that. Downtown was covered in black soot and black smoke, and yet everybody likes to talk about those were the days. And look at our downtown now.
I think sometimes our memories are more than a little clouded. Again, I turn back to that term nostalgia because so much of what we are or who we are, how we grew up, is rooted in things like where did we have family dinners and
hmm
Where did we play as children?
Yeah.
What do we remember as the landmarks in
hmm
Toledo?
hmm Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I speak to groups about this book, it resonates so well. I start throwing up some of these menus on the screen, and you could see people just instantly start to smile. It's because they're going back in their head and they're remembering some family memory or some fond memory of being at that restaurant. It's pretty fun.
I'll bet. I'll bet. Now, the name of the book and where can we get it?
The book is called Table for None: Lost Eateries of Toledo. And it's available now on Amazon. But in the next week or two, it'll be available at Gathering Volumes in Perrysburg and Titke's in Monclova, Maumee.
Can't let you go without rehashing a little bit about the Toledo papers.
Sure. Um, that is still available, obviously, out on Amazon. It's also available at Gathering Volumes and will be available at Titke's soon. It's again, and that was a fun book that took a lot of work to pull together, but it's essentially a compilation of stories about Toledo that are essentially triggered off of either a letter or some piece of ephemera. Could be a letterhead. And, each story has its own unique theme and backstory, and I think there's about 28 different stories in the book.
When I read the book, I was amazed at how quickly I was drawn into Toledo history.
Yeah, I mean the first chapter is 1805, and it's a letter written from Fort Industry back to a gentleman in Connecticut. And you think Fort Industry? Yeah, I'm aware of what that is. It's a row of buildings downtown. Then you read this letter, and then you read the backstory, and it's an exciting story. And at the end, you've learned something about Toledo history, but at the same time, you had a pretty good ride.
If you're really fascinated by Toledo history, uh, you've got a website with a lot of interesting vignettes on it.
Yeah, that's holytoledohistory.com. And you can find out information about the books there as well as the GPS tours that we do on your phone. We also now have a podcast. There's some really good stuff there. We just did a deep dive into John Ketchum, Valentine Ketchum's son. And there's also a spot there where you can learn more about some of the other things that are going on in the blog.
You don't like to be called a historian as much as a storyteller.
That's right. I tell people I feel that, it's kind of an insult to somebody who goes on to get a PhD. That's true historians in my book. And I'm just a history buff who likes to tell stories. So, I mean, I've learned a lot, and I feel like I've earned, a good reputation from the research I've done. But I leave the historian label up to those who, really took it to the nth degree.
Ted Long's new book, Table for None: Lost Eateries of Toledo. Ted, as always, a pleasure chatting. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's our program for this week. I'd love to hear from you. Contact me through my webpage, londonmitchell.news. And please accept this invitation to join us next week as we continue staying in contact.
Previous installments of Staying in Contact with London Mitchell are available on the Stream 419 app, Spotify, and londonmitchell.news.